December 8, 1941. Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital. The air still carried the acrid stench of burning oil, a black pillar visible through the windows where the Arizona continued to smolder beneath the Pacific waters. In a commandeered storage room converted hastily into an interrogation space, a young Japanese pilot sat with his hands bandaged, burns covering 30% of his body. Flight Petty Officer Kazuo Sakamaki had become America's first prisoner of war of the Pacific conflict. Outside, American sailors still pulled bodies from the harbor. Inside, Sakamaki waited for the brutality he had been promised would come, the savage American vengeance his commanders had described in pre-mission briefings. He closed his eyes and prepared to die with honor. The door opened. A Navy doctor entered, carrying morphine and clean dressings. This was not the script Imperial Japan had written, and in the years that followed, in camps scattered across the continental United States, from Texas to Wisconsin, from California to the Carolinas, thousands of Axis prisoners would encounter the same profound cognitive dissonance, a rupture between ideology and reality so complete that it would reduce hardened soldiers to tears not from cruelty, but from its absence, not from deprivation, but from abundance, not from America's strength in December 1941, but from how terrifyingly fast that strength multiplied after defeat. The Imperial Japanese Navy had struck Pearl Harbor believing they had bought themselves 18 months, perhaps 2 years, before American industrial capacity could respond. German military intelligence, still flush with confidence from their blitzkrieg victories across Europe, estimated that the United States, if it ever truly mobilized, would require 3 to 4 years to pose a genuine threat to Fortress Europe. Both Axis powers had studied American society and found it wanting, soft, consumerist, fractured by regional divisions, populated by citizens more interested in jazz and Hollywood than martial discipline. They had measured American resolve and found it theatrical rather than genuine. They had made calculations based on the America of 1940. They could not have imagined the America of 1943. By late 1942, the first waves of German U-boat crews began arriving at American POW camps, sullen and defiant, still believing in ultimate victory despite their capture. They had been briefed on American prison camps through the lens of Nazi propaganda. Expect starvation rations, brutal labor, perhaps execution. The Geneva Conventions were, in their understanding, paper promises that decadent democracies abandoned when tested. They were soldiers of the Kriegsmarine, the wolf-pack hunters who had brought England to the edge of starvation. They expected to be treated as dangerous enemies. What they received instead was 3 meals per day, totaling nearly 3,000 calories, more than many of them had eaten as free men in Germany, where rationing had begun to bite hard. By 1942, they were issued 2 sets of work clothes, underwear changed twice weekly, and shoes that fit. The barracks, while Spartan, were heated. There were showers with hot water. Medical care was provided without cost, without judgment. When a German submariner named Klaus Richter developed appendicitis at Camp Hearn in Texas, he was transported to a civilian hospital, operated on by an American surgeon, and returned to camp to recuperate. He had expected to die. Instead, he gained 12 pounds during his recovery. The cognitive dissonance began as confusion, then slowly curdled into something more destabilizing: doubt. But it was not the material comfort alone that broke through the ideological conditioning. It was what that comfort represented, and how impossibly quickly it had manifested. These men had been captured in 1942 and early 1943, mere months after America's entry into the war. They had expected to find a nation still reeling, still organizing, still trying to remember how to make weapons instead of Chevrolets and washing machines. Instead, they found themselves in a country that had performed an industrial metamorphosis so rapid it seemed to violate the laws of economic physics. Japanese prisoners arriving at camps in late 1943 and 1944 brought with them the direct experience of American production capacity translated into military reality. They had seen it in the skies over the Pacific, wave after wave of American aircraft, more planes in a single formation than their entire base had possessed. They had seen it in the naval engagements where American destroyers and carriers appeared with supernatural frequency, replacing losses faster than Japanese intelligence could track. One Japanese naval officer, Commander Takeo Yoshikawa, captured after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, sat in stunned silence during his initial interrogation when informed of American ship production numbers. When his interrogator repeated them, believing Yoshikawa had misunderstood, the commander began to weep. "You built how many Essex-class carriers?" he asked, in halting English. 17 are currently operational, the American intelligence officer replied, consulting his notes, with 7 more under construction. Yoshikawa had served in a navy that had begun the war with 10 carriers and had seen that number steadily dwindle, each loss irreplaceable. The mathematics of it broke something inside his understanding of the war's trajectory. Japan had spent 2 years attempting to achieve strategic parity through superior tactics and fighting spirit. America had responded by building a fleet larger than Japan's entire pre-war navy in less time than it took to train a carrier pilot to competency. The same revelation came to German prisoners through different channels. At Camp Como in Mississippi, Luftwaffe pilots who had flown against American bomber formations over Germany found themselves in proximity to a lumber mill that had been converted to produce wooden components for aircraft. The mill operated in 3 shifts, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. The German pilots, allowed to work in the mill for wages that could be used in the camp canteen, watched as thousands of components moved through production each day. A captain named Heinrich Müller, a decorated ace with 43 kills, stood at the assembly line one evening after his shift, watching the river of aircraft parts flow toward waiting trucks. "Do you know what we called the American bomber crews?" he said to his guard, a farm boy from Iowa who spoke minimal German but had struck up an awkward friendship with Müller. "Himmelfahrtskommando, suicide crews. We shot down so many, the numbers should have stopped them." The guard, not fully understanding, nodded politely. "But they just kept coming," Müller continued, his voice distant. "More bombers, always more. We could not understand the numbers. Now I understand. This is one mill in one small town in one state, and this is just wood, just pieces." He fell silent, his hands still smelling of sawdust and pine resin, the scent of American industrial capacity made tangible. The symbol that recurred most frequently in prisoner testimonies, the object that became shorthand for everything they had failed to understand about America, was absurdly mundane: bread. Not the dense, dark rye bread of Germany or the rice of Japan, but soft, white American bread produced in quantities that seemed to mock the very concept of scarcity. In German camps across the American South and Midwest, prisoners were given bread without limit, as much as they could eat, baked fresh daily in camp kitchens or delivered from civilian bakeries under contract. Many prisoners, conditioned by years of rationing, initially hoarded their bread rations, hiding loaves in footlockers or under mattresses, unable to believe the supply would continue. It always continued. A German corporal named Josef Kramer, captured in North Africa with Rommel's Afrika Korps, wrote in a letter to his wife, letters that were censored but preserved in military archives, about the bread. "We receive more bread in one day than our families saw in a week in Munich. The Americans throw away what we would have treasured. I watched a guard yesterday discard half a sandwich because he was full." Full, Marta. I do not know how to explain what this means. They fight us with one hand and feed their prisoners with the other, and both hands overflow with plenty. The plenty was strategic, but it was also genuine. American agricultural production had not contracted during wartime mobilization. It had expanded. Mechanization of farming, already well advanced before the war, had accelerated. Tractors that had been building American highways were converted to military vehicles, but more tractors rolled off production lines to replace them. Hybrid corn varieties increased yields by 30%. Victory gardens appeared in 20 million American backyards, but this was civic participation, not survival necessity. The civilian population experienced rationing of sugar, butter, coffee, and gasoline, but not bread, not calories, not the baseline security of food itself. For prisoners from nations where hunger had become national policy, where butter had disappeared from shops, where meat was a monthly luxury, where ersatz coffee made from acorns was the morning standard, the American relationship with food was incomprehensible. More than that, it was revelatory. It suggested that perhaps the ideological frameworks they had fought for were built on false premises about resource competition, about zero-sum survival, about the necessity of conquest for prosperity. But the transformation in prisoner consciousness was not instantaneous or universal. Many remained committed National Socialists or Imperial Loyalists throughout their captivity. The camps themselves were sorted by ideology when possible, hardcore Nazis separated from those deemed less fanatical to prevent intimidation and violence. Yet even among the true believers, cracks appeared, widened by the simple passage of time and the accumulation of observed reality. The speed of American adaptation became another recurring theme in prisoner testimony, particularly among officers who had been briefed on American military capabilities before their capture. The United States Army that stumbled in North Africa in early 1943, suffering defeats at Kasserine Pass, was supposed to be the real America, undisciplined, tactically naive, over-reliant on material superiority, without the combat experience to leverage it effectively. German field reports from Tunisia in February 1943 reinforced pre-war assessments. American troops panicked under artillery fire, their officers were uncertain, their coordination poor. By September 1943, those same American forces had landed in Italy with precision and violence that stunned German defenders. By June 1944, the Normandy invasion demonstrated operational sophistication that matched or exceeded any military operation the Wehrmacht had conducted. The time elapsed between Kasserine Pass and Omaha Beach was 16 months. In those 16 months, the American military had not just grown in size, it had evolved in competence at a rate German military theorists had considered impossible. Institutional learning curves were supposed to take years, even decades. America had compressed that timeline through systematic after-action analysis, brutal honesty about failures, rapid integration of lessons learned, and a cultural willingness to promote based on competence rather than aristocratic background or political loyalty. German POWs who were educated, who had studied military history, recognized what they were witnessing. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, a former Wehrmacht major named Dietrich von Schell, who held a doctorate in history from Heidelberg University, organized an informal lecture series for fellow prisoners. In one lecture, preserved in notes taken by an American intelligence officer monitoring the camp, von Schell drew parallels to the Roman military system, another society that had transformed defeat into institutional knowledge, that had lost battles but learned from them faster than its enemies could exploit the victories. Rome lost battles for 200 years, von Schell told his audience of captive soldiers, but they lost each battle only once. They never repeated the same mistake. The Americans have inherited this. We have defeated them in battles, yes, but we have given them an education, and they have proven to be excellent students. In the audience, men wept. Not from shame at their capture, but from the dawning realization that they had been soldiers in a cause that had fundamentally miscalculated. They had been told that democracies were weak, that diverse societies could not compete with racially homogeneous warrior cultures, that industrial capacity alone could not substitute for military tradition and fighting spirit. Every day in captivity provided evidence that these were comfortable lies, ideological fairy tales that had sent them into a war they were always going to lose. The Japanese prisoners experienced their own parallel awakening, though filtered through different cultural frameworks. The Bushido code that had prepared them for death had not prepared them for mercy, for medical care, for the peculiar American insistence on treating enemies as human beings with rights under international law. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, a Japanese soldier named Yoshio Nakamura, who had been captured on Guadalcanal, more dead than alive from malaria and malnutrition, spent 2 months in the camp hospital. American nurses, young women from Milwaukee and Madison, cared for him without evident hatred, without the contempt he had expected as a failed warrior who had allowed himself to be captured. When he finally recovered enough to be moved to the general population barracks, Nakamura asked his interpreter a question. Why do they not hate us? We killed their brothers, their sons. We are the enemy. Why do they heal us as if we are their own? The interpreter, a Nisei soldier whose own family was confined in an internment camp in California, an irony and injustice not lost on anyone involved, struggled to answer. They hate what you did, he finally said, but they don't hate what you are. There's a difference here. I don't fully understand it myself. This distinction between action and essence, between the role of enemy soldier and the underlying humanity beneath the uniform, was philosophically alien to prisoners raised in totalitarian ideologies that defined human worth by race, by service to the state, by position in rigid hierarchies. The American worldview, however imperfectly practiced, however compromised by its own racial injustices and hypocrisies, contained within it a stubborn belief in individual worth that transcended temporary enmity. It was this belief made manifest in 3 meals per day and heated barracks and medical care and wages for labor that corroded ideological certainty more effectively than any propaganda could have. By 1945, as the war ground toward its conclusion, American POW camps held over 400,000 prisoners, Germans, Italians, Japanese, scattered across the American heartland in camps that had been constructed in months, administered according to international law, and supplied with the overflow of American abundance. Many prisoners worked in agriculture, helping to harvest the crops that fed both America and its allies, paid wages that seemed absurd, prisoners earning money to send home to families in nations that America was actively bombing. The contradiction of it, the sheer strangeness of being treated as something other than disposable enemy assets, created psychological transformations that would outlast the war itself. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, German POWs in American camps heard the news and understood, many for the first time, that they would survive, that they would go home, that America, which could have worked them to death or executed them or simply abandoned them to starvation, had instead kept them alive, kept them fed, kept them human. The gratitude was complicated, mixed with grief for their lost nation, shame at defeat, continued loyalty to comrades who had not survived. But the gratitude was real. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Japanese prisoners faced a different crisis. Many requested to remain in America rather than return to a homeland they knew would view them as disgraced, as failures who had violated the warrior code by surviving. America denied these requests. Repatriation was mandatory under international law. But the very fact that men who had been raised to view death as preferable to surrender now chose life, now wanted to remain among their former enemies, spoke to how completely their understanding of the world had been reconstructed. In the years after the war, thousands of former Axis POWs would write letters to their former captors to to camp commanders, to guards, to American families who had shown them small kindnesses. These letters, preserved in military archives and private collections, formed an accidental record of transformation. They spoke of disbelief turned to understanding, of hatred softened by experience, of ideological certainty undermined by the mundane generosity of a nation that had been attacked and yet refused to become what its enemies claimed it was. America had learned from Pearl Harbor, from Kasserine Pass, from Savo Island, from every early defeat and setback. It had learned with terrifying speed, compressed institutional evolution into compressed timeframes, turned industrial capacity and democratic flexibility into weapons as potent as any bomb. But perhaps the most profound lesson America taught was not delivered on battlefields. It was delivered in prison camps across the interior of the nation, far from combat, where the losers of battles became students of a different kind of victory, the victory of a system that could be attacked and yet respond not with barbarism, but with abundance, not with vengeance, but with law, not with the cruelty its enemies practiced, but with the stubborn, irrational, deeply American belief that even enemies were human, and that even in war some principles were worth preserving. The tears that fell in those camps were not tears of physical suffering. They were tears of dissonance resolved, of lies exposed, of worldviews shattered by the simplest of truths, that the nation they had been told was weak had proven strong, that the society they had been told was decadent had proven resilient, and that the values they had been told were disadvantages had proven, in the end, to be unquantifiable strategic assets. December 1941 had been America's worst day, but from that defeat, from that burning harbor and those shattered battleships, America had extracted lessons and compressed them into action with a speed that defied historical precedent. And the men who fought against that transformed nation, when they finally became its prisoners, discovered that America's most devastating weapon was not its bombers or its tanks or its factories. It was its refusal to abandon its principles, even when principles seemed like weakness, especially then. The bread kept coming, the wounded were healed, the prisoners were fed, and in that persistent irrational generosity, ideology died more thoroughly than any bullet could have killed it.